Hello, good morning. Good morning, and welcome back to The Good, the Bad, and the Uncanny, exploring the Older Testament. It is good to be together this morning. Today we're going to be looking at the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, and Ruth. And as we proceed today, we'll talk about why we're drawing these particular books together. We'll start with some announcements this morning. First of all, I'm actually kind of glad to see that we have a little bit of a sparser population here in the room today, because there are two important things going on this morning. We are here in our discussion of the Older Testament, and in the Social Justice Forum, they are exploring a series of Gaza in context. If you didn't get a chance to catch the recording, last week Linda Evans was here. She is the vice chair of Bright Stars of Bethlehem. She gave a presentation on the root causes of the war in Gaza. And this week, Nathan Stock, who is a non-resident scholar with the Middle East Institute, will give a, right now at the same time, is giving a presentation on Gaza in context. It's sort of a historical review of Gaza in the 20th century. So glad that you're here and learning about the Older Testament, and would really also commend to you that you look on our Vimeo page, that you look on our website for that presentation as well. And just we're really grateful to the Social Justice Forum for putting on this series. So wanted to make sure to commend that to you all. In our study of the Older Testament, our interview this week is with Christine Hayes of Yale. She was my undergrad professor of Older Testament. It was really a joy to connect with her. She's got a lot of really interesting things to say about these books, so I would commend that video to you as well. The reading guide, you'll see a print copy before you, and you'll notice that we left off the reading guide for this week, what to read for Ezra, Ruth, and Nehemiah, which is unfortunate, because it's hard to read the entire books of Ezra and Nehemiah. Reading all of Ruth is a joy, but there are particular parts that we would suggest that you emphasize for Ezra and Nehemiah and skip the genealogies. Maybe you figured that out on your own. But the copy that's online is updated with the correct information. So the print copy that we have doesn't include the reading guide for this week, but the online version does. So if you're reading along, please check that out. We'll have discussion groups this coming Wednesday on Zoom and in the Meisel room. And then, not this coming week, next week, February 14th, is Ash Wednesday. So make sure to come for services. There's a noon service and a 6 p.m. service. They'll be largely similar. The noon service is in the chapel. 6 p.m. will be in Westminster Hall. And with Ash Wednesday, Lent begins, which is your opportunity to sign up for Church in the Round. These are 5-week discussion groups. This time we'll be exploring the book of Psalms. In some ways, it'll be a continuation of our adult ed program. We're not doing a separate class on the Psalms. We're instead sort of entering into the Psalms as this 5-week group exploration. If you are new to Westminster, or if you are joining us online, you are very welcome to participate in this. Please reach out to me, Margaret Fox, or Matt Skinner. Our contact information is on the website about ways to connect. And if you are with us online, we have Zoom versions of the Church in the Round groups, so you're very able and welcome to participate in that way. Any questions about Church in the Round as we get started? You're also, if you're in the room, there are purple cards. You're able to sign up by a purple card or sign up online on Realm. Okay, so when we talk about Ezra and Nehemiah, we're going to be talking about rebuilding, about the exiles returning from captivity and rebuilding their city, their temple, their walls, their culture. And so we'll start with a little bit of table conversation and ask you to reflect on an experience of rebuilding, either a physical rebuilding or a rebuilding moment in your own life or the life of the community. Try to think if you can remember a time that was a rebuilding time in your own life or the life of a group that you were part of. And I want to ask you to reflect on what was hopeful about that and what was hard about it. And I'll give you a couple minutes at your tables to think about this question. just kind of lost connectivity here. Did I kick something? Oh. I'll try not to. Just...
I'd come and go this way.
Okay, do that. I'm trying to stay elevated.
Oh, we're on your slide. Have you seen the evolution of this with the picture-in-picture and the slides? It's like a newscast.
This is a pretty simple experience. I've been sharing it with colleagues. All right, I'm going to call folks back together and ask for any reflections from your groups on an experience of rebuilding. Any thoughts? I see Clay.
I guess at our table we talked about kind of two things. One was rebuilding something physical, and the other thing is rebuilding something more like your life or your career or whatever. And we thought those things were much more difficult because there's no roadmap to take you to, like a house. It's like, well, this is what it's going to be. So
Yep. There's not that blueprints, and then there's not the how do we know that we're done on the other side of it, right? That kind of intangible work of rebuilding can sometimes be even more challenging. Yeah, other thoughts on rebuilding? I see in the corner back here.
You didn't give us enough time because I kind of talked about it. I think rebuilding requires personal effort, personal hard work, but it requires a community to rebuild.
Yep, absolutely. So rebuilding requires time, a personal effort, and community effort. It's something that is done together. Yeah, other thoughts about this? Yes, Margie.
Hi, thank you. I think in my life there's been times when things have really felt like they've fallen apart and disasters, and yet, it was really a gift, and it changed my life forever, and it made me stronger. So I try to tell my kids that sometimes it looks like this is the worst thing possible, but as we know, even from the Bible, sometimes the worst things are really gifts in our life.
Yeah, so there's a way in which sometimes an ending becomes a beginning. Something taken away becomes an opportunity, which doesn't mean it's not incredibly painful, right? And I think that is one theme that we'll see throughout this story is joy and mourning happening, sometimes even simultaneously. We'll get to a moment where that even happens simultaneously in this story. Yeah, any other thoughts on rebuilding? Yes, I see Bill.
We were talking about a period of time actually when Ruth and I met, and we were both going through a period of redefining ourselves. Mm-hmm. And the thing that was interesting about that to me is that for me especially, I didn't know where this was going. I just had, it was just putting one foot in front of the other and just seeing where it was going and just having faith that I was going someplace.
Yeah. An openness to the future, right? And requiring a certain amount of trust without actually knowing what the next thing was going to be. That's lovely. Well, thank you for your reflections on rebuilding. We're going to enter into the story here and see how the Bible is reflecting on this rebuilding in this period, and what we like about this and what we don't like about this. Right? We're going to encounter some things that are really beautiful in these texts, and we're going to encounter some things that are really difficult in this text. I think at this point in the class, you guys are used to that by now. So we'll see both of those here. Returning to our timeline. Here's our setup. United Kingdom divides and then falls. There's a period of captivity in Babylon. And then Cyrus's edict allowing return. And we're going to look into this a lot. Cyrus's edict will be quoted here. It'll feature prominently. There are actually going to be multiple edicts that will show this return process happening. And as we're going to see, it doesn't happen in all one fell swoop, right? It's not like 539 happens, captives return, rebuild the temple and the wall. I mean, this is a process that takes generations to unfold. Second Temple Judaism, we had a sneak peek forward into that with Daniel last week. We have Isaiah, let's see. We have our prophets, right? Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and here's Ezekiel. And then now we finally get to Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra and Nehemiah belongs to this Second Temple period, the beginning of this Second Temple period. And a lot of what Ezra and Nehemiah is dealing with is the reconstruction of this temple that gives its name to this period. So that's where we are, right? We've come through the worst of destruction and devastation, and we're sort of headed up towards this moment of return. A couple things to say about the style of these books. Ezra is primarily, although not exclusively, written in the third person. Parts of it are in Aramaic. We saw some Aramaic last week with Daniel as well, which is the language of imperial administration of the Persian Empire. And it's also sort of becoming the vernacular. Some of the people are actually more fluent in Aramaic than they are in Hebrew at this point. And we think that Ezra was likely composed in the late 5th century. Nehemiah is actually narrated in the first person. It's the form of a memoir. We'll see Nehemiah has a high opinion of himself. That'll show up in the way that this memoir is written. And this is a unique form in the Older Testament. We don't see a lot of memoir. Ezra as a character shows up in Nehemiah, and this may be a bit of a later addition. I think there was some later scribal attempts to kind of reconcile these two stories of return and to weave them into one seamless whole. But overall, these show us kind of the stylistic diversity in this period of biblical literature. There's not a single unified style or genre or voice here. We're gonna see even more as we go forward what shows up in terms of the variety of formats. And there's a real desire to leave a contemporaneous written record of events. It's not, some of the older stories happened a long time before they were written down. We don't have contemporaneous records of Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. Those are sort of oral traditions that are later written down. But here, putting things in writing feels important, because the people are operating in the context of a well-administered empire. So if decrees are coming down in writing from the Persians, there's this sort of corresponding desire to record history as it's happening. So let's look at these decrees. The Edict of Cyrus. Does anybody remember which biblical book we encountered the Edict of Cyrus in? Which of the prophets? This was in 2nd Isaiah. Remember when everybody got so excited about returning, and God had appointed Cyrus from the north to allow the people to return. Cyrus was sort of considered an instrument of God's will here. And so the beginning, these are the first lines of the book of Ezra, and it sets that up as well. So Cyrus is, the time is marked by the Persian king, not an Israelite king, but the Persian king. That's how we know what year this is. And there is a reference to Jeremiah's prophecy of return. Remember Jeremiah saying 70 years, build houses in captivity, plant vineyards, seek the welfare because you'll be there for a while, but you will return. And so this is seen as the fulfillment of that promise of Jeremiah's of return. The Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus. Cyrus is an instrument of God here. God is seen as powerful enough to have dominion over foreign emperors as well. And then we get this written Edict of Cyrus. This image is of a cylinder that's believed to be the Cyrus cylinder. There are more and more archaeological records of these things as well. This is not an exact quote of the Cyrus cylinder, but it's a reference to an Edict of Cyrus. And we do think that the Persians we do think that it is historical that the Persians were encouraging peoples to return to their homelands as they set up their new empire. And the edict says, "Thus says King Cyrus of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth," right? Again, emphasis on God being over Cyrus. And he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem in Judah. This is the same building God a house that we saw David contemplating and Solomon carrying out. "Any of those among you who are of his people," so an idea of God having a particular special people who are called to go and do this work, "are now permitted to go up to Jerusalem and rebuild the house." And the edict also says, "Let those who are doing this rebuilding be assisted by the people of their place with silver and gold." Right? Anytime you do a building project, you got to figure out how to pay for it. And so the payment for the reconstruction of the temple is going to figure largely, and it's funded here in part by taxes on the people who are already residing in the land. We're going to see a lot of conflict between the returning exiles and the people who have stayed in the land, because remember, not everybody was carried off into captivity, and some of that is going to have to do with the finances of this whole thing. And there's this requirement that others assist in this as well. So the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin. Now remember, this is the southern kingdom that was taken into exile in Babylon. So Judah and Benjamin are those tribes. It's those family heads who are returning, along with the priests and the Levites, the priestly class. They got ready to go. Their neighbors assisted them with these financial contributions, these things of value. And then Cyrus himself brought out the vessels of the house of the Lord that Nebuchadnezzar had carried away. So if you remember that plot point that we saw in Jeremiah and Ezekiel of the Babylonians carrying off the temple treasures of the temple, this is a sort of a return, not just of the people, but of the sacred artifacts of the temple. That's what's being sort of that's what's being shown here. So the heads of the families of Judah and Benjamin, they're not the only ones who are worshiping God. They're not the only ones who worship Yahweh. The Samaritans, the people of the northern kingdom, also had worshiped Yahweh, but in different ways and in different places. And some of those peoples are going to remain in the land. So we'll see these conflicts. And Samaritan, the Good Samaritan of the New Testament, that's that same word. We're seeing some through lines here of who those peoples are. And a big question is going to be how to relate to those who are currently living in the land, including Samaritans. Okay, so I put here, why so nice, Cyrus? What are you doing here? What's this all about, right? In the framing of the Bible, it's because God appointed Cyrus to do this, right? The Lord is using Cyrus, and that is enough of an answer within the Bible's framework. We might ask some historical and sort of geopolitical questions about what's going on here. Why is Cyrus, out of the goodness of his heart, picking this particular people and allowing them to return to their homeland? Well, this is part of a larger Persian policy of exiles returning. That Cyrus Cylinder proclaims it too, not just for the Judeans, but for peoples who had been displaced under the Assyrian and Babylonian empires. The Persians are instituting a policy of religious tolerance and of people returning to their homelands. Part of this comes from their own experience. The Persians had been under Babylonian rule. They know what that felt like, right? So part of this does come from an experience of being oppressed. But it also comes from some significant cultural differences. The Persians are not of a piece with the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They're running their empire in a different way. They were competent and able administrators of empire. If you've had any sort of classical training, you may remember the Persian Wars, right? The Greeks fight the Persians, and the Greeks are these austere little proto-democrats, and they fight off this eastern menace of the opulent, effete Persian Empire, so corrupt. So I think often we can get a skewed view of the Persian Empire that comes out of historians like Herodotus. And recent scholarship is actually looking at the Persian Empire with some significant admiration for what they accomplished, right? Not to say that their methods were gentle, but their administrative skills were very remarkable. They built roads and communication networks. They were able to maintain over a longer period stability in a much larger empire. And so part of this practice of local return was not just out of being nice to the locals, but they saw it as a way of strengthening their empire. So they allowed local officials to serve as governors, and part of that was it allowed there to be a lot of tax revenue to fund all of these projects of infrastructure. And so this return is not a return to an autonomous kingdom. We're not setting up a new Davidic king here, although we'll see some people from the lineage of David appointed as governors, but they're not autonomous kings. This is not a return to political independence in the way that we saw during the period of the kingdoms. It happens in 4 waves, and we'll go through each of those waves, but there's a pattern that recurs in each of them. They begin with an imperial edict from Persia throughout this succession of emperors. They name the Jewish leaders who are spearheading the return movement. There's a roster of returning exiles. If you didn't have the reading guide, I would have told you to skip all the rosters. But you learn something actually from those rosters because it names the people, it numbers the people, it shows their lineage. Ezra and Nehemiah are very interested in who's descended from who. How is there a through line of family descent that was maintained during the period of exile and is returning? So it'll give that roster, and that's, while we may be able to skim that, that's actually an important feature within the logic of these books. And then they enjoy unimpeded travel because of God's favor. There are enemies along the way, but the exiles sort of make it back to Judah. And then they encounter local opposition from the people who are living in the land. So we see it's not exactly this neat, but we see this pattern returning in each of these 4 waves of return. The first happens under Cyrus. The Jewish leader is named Sheshbazzar. That's probably not a household name. He's only named a couple of times in the book of Ezra. We don't know too much about this phase of return, but this is where the work of the temple got started, but had to remain unfinished. So this is just that sort of initial beginning of return. And I want to pause here and ask, does anybody remember the vision of the temple that we saw at the end of the prophet Ezekiel? It was the tail end of the prophet Ezekiel. He's taken in a vision back to Jerusalem. It's this vision of the future, and there's a man with like a measuring stick, like a 6 cubit long measuring stick, who takes him around and shows him this idealized, reconstructed temple. And so part of Ezekiel's vision is of what this city and the temple is going to look like, and it's all perfect and glowing. This is not what the reality is on the ground, right? There's going to be part of the challenge of rebuilding is the disconnect between expectations and reality. And it's not an easy process. It's one that takes place in fits and starts. So Sheshbazzar begins the temple, but then has to leave it unfinished. And so we get a second stage of return. There's a new emperor, Darius. The Jewish leaders are Zerubbabel, who he's not a household name either, but he's famous enough to have a painting. You know, he's playing a little bit of a larger role here. He's the grandson of King Jehoiachin, the Judahite king who was taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar. So there's a link to the Davidic lineage, although he's not installed as a new king here. He may be functioning in a little bit more of a governor-like role. And then Jeshua is a priest. And then there's 2 prophets, Haggai and Zechariah. We didn't linger over those, but their names are in the role of the minor prophets. We looked at Amos of the minor prophets. Haggai and Zechariah are 2 of those 2. So we have here those 3 functions of prophet, priest, and king. So we see a sort of a restoration, not just of this building project, but of some of the cultural functions are returning here. And so the first thing they do is to build an altar and to sacrifice burnt offerings on that altar, and to reorganize the calendar of festivals and offerings. So it's not just creating sacred space, but also sacred time. What are the rhythms of the life of the people returning to the land? And then they brought in materials for the temple project, and they started the 2nd year after their arrival. So they made a beginning with all the priests and the Levites and the people. The people are named repeatedly and included. We get the names of the leaders. We don't get the names of the individual people, but they're frequently mentioned here to show that this is a project that engages at all levels of society. So they lay the foundations, and then they have a celebration, sort of a ribbon cutting, if you will. But instead of scissors, there's trumpets, and so they use cymbals. They use these lines you might recognize from a psalm: "For God is good, God's steadfast love endures forever." So there's this big celebration of rebuilding, and the people respond with a great shout when they praise the Lord because the foundation of the temple had been laid. This is that moment of real hopefulness. But many of the priests and Levites and the heads of families, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful shout from the sound of the people's weeping, for the people shouted so loudly that the sound was heard far away. I love this passage. I love this vision of return. I wish this showed up in our lectionary more, because it's this combination of the people who remember what was, not just what the old temple was like, but all of the pain that took place in between that temple and this one, combined with the hopefulness of this new moment, and that these feelings of joy and mourning take place at the same time. The shouts are intermingled and indistinguishable here. I think this is one of the most beautiful moments in the Bible, and says something very true about what it's like to rebuild, because part of rebuilding is you're not starting entirely from scratch. You have the memories of what came before, and those stay with us. And so that's a part of this season here. Again, as our pattern, there's opposition. There's adversaries of Judah and Benjamin who heard that this is happening. They want to be involved. They want skin in the game of this new temple, but the returning Judahites push them out and say, no, this is our work to do. You shall have no part with us. We alone will build the Lord. This was the command. And what this instigates is not a military battle, but a letter writing campaign to the Persian emperor, right? So it's no longer people taking up arms against each other. We will see some armed opposition when we get to Nehemiah, but here it's a battle of influence rather than of weapons. So they're writing to the Persians, and the Persians are going back in their own archives to find Cyrus's original edict. What did that say? And so there's a sense in which the rules of conflict are different now because of imperial presence, and the way that you win influence is to appeal to historical record and appeal to the influence of the local officials who are in communication with the emperor. That's the sort of scene that people are operating in now. And the warning is, if we allow too much rebuilding, the people will rebel. Right? The opponents of rebuilding are saying to the emperor, if you let them rebuild their temple, if you let them rebuild their walls, they'll want autonomy next. So that's how these arguments go back and forth. Ultimately, the emperor sides with, in the telling of Ezra and Nehemiah, the emperor sides with the rebuilding project, and it's allowed to go forward. So we get to the third stage, a new Persian emperor, and the Jewish leader now is Ezra, who goes back. And Ezra is more of a household name. You might know somebody named, you probably don't know Zerubbabel, but you might know some Ezras, right? So we're getting into a little bit more of the more famous part of the story. And his work is to codify the Mosaic law. The temple has been built, but now how do we live as a people together? His is a cultural project. He comes from the priestly lineage of the Zadokites. Ezekiel was a Zadokite. And he's a scribe described as skilled in the law, which is the Torah. We shouldn't think of this as a legal code as much as teaching or instruction, the sort of inherited wisdom for life together as community, the traditions that bind the people. And he set his heart to study the law of the Lord, to study it and to do it, right, to live according to this law, and to teach the statutes and ordinances in Israel. So he's not a scribe in the sense of copyist alone. He's not preparing these texts for a small community of elites. His role is to teach the people, and we'll see him doing that a little bit later. For some reason, that section gets moved to the end of Nehemiah, so when we get to there, we'll look at that part. And his commission is to go to Jerusalem, supervise the temple that's been rebuilt, assess how we're doing in implementing the law, and appoint officials, scribes, and judges to carry out this administration, and then bring treasures of silver and gold to the temple. Again, this how do we pay for things, right? And bring a copy of the Mosaic Torah. That's included in the commission that he's getting from the Persian emperor. So we'll see Ezra carrying this out a little bit later when we get to the book of Nehemiah. But let's look at that fourth stage. We actually don't know who came first, Ezra or Nehemiah. Scholars tend to guess that it was Ezra and then Nehemiah, but there's some confusion about which emperor this was happening under. So I'm saying, I think I'm giving you perhaps a neater version of this history than we actually know, but scholars tend to think probably Nehemiah came next. And his thing was building walls. Nehemiah, wall builder, temple had been built, law had been set up. Now how do we protect and defend the city, but also build the walls kind of as a way to establish the identity of the city. And And so Nehemiah as a figure, so Ezra of a priestly lineage, Nehemiah is an official in the Persian court. He serves as the cupbearer to the king. This is a minor fact you have to know when you're ordained as a Presbyterian minister. It shows up in the Bible content exam, this obscure piece of trivia. He hears about, and this is the only time in my entire career that I've ever used that piece of information, so knew it would come in handy at some point. He hears of the poor conditions in Jerusalem, right? It's not all going according to Ezekiel's vision. And so he asks for permission to return and restore the walls. And he's granted that by the Persian emperor, permission to engage in this project. Because he was a cupbearer, he was most likely a eunuch, which would disqualify him by the law from entering the temple. So Nehemiah, and it would also, he's not going to come back and establish a new lineage as king. He's operating in the official, in the sort of official court of the king. And often that was the case, that people who were that close to the king's entourage, it was thought dangerous if they were able to, in some ways, now I'm talking about things I don't want to talk about, sort of enter into the genetic lineage of the king. And so they were often made eunuchs as a way to prevent that from happening. But Nehemiah is this sort of trusted court figure of the king and allowed to go to Judah and carry out this project. And eventually he's appointed as governor, not as king. And so walls, right? Why do walls matter? There weren't actually walls in the earliest days of Israel, in part because the Egyptians were ascendant and there wasn't as much need for them. The wall building happened in the period following the decline of Egypt as a power, sort of before the rise of Assyria, when the competition was among a lot of local groups. So walls aren't as necessary in the Persian period because, as we talked about earlier, stability provided by the empire, but they hold this real symbolic value of sort of restoring the identity of the city. Nehemiah goes out alone for this late night inspection. As you can see, he's the hero of his own story. He goes out and he inspects the walls by night. He sees that they'd been broken down and destroyed by the fire. And so then he recruits the nobles and officials and the people of Jerusalem to say, come, let us rebuild the walls so that we may no longer suffer disgrace, right? Not so that we may defend ourselves, but so that we may no longer suffer disgrace, this restoration of communal identity. And so they committed themselves to the common good, is how it's described here. Part of Nehemiah's project is to rally the powerful to participate in the common good of the city, to not just seek their own ends, but to help the common good of the city that they've returned to. We have, as per our pattern, opposition from Sanballat the Horonite, which is probably a Samaritan, Tobiah the Ammonite, although he's probably a Jew who works for the Ammonites. And they are, again, accusing these wall builders of wanting to rebel against the Persians. And once again, we have rejection from Nehemiah, who says, you have no share in this. This is our project, not yours. There's this drawing a line between the returning exiles and the people who live in the land. And at the same time, there's support from those who have come back. The high priest Eliashib, who is a grandson of one of the original returning high priests, and his fellow priests are helping with the gate, the men of Jericho, and then Zachar, son of Imri. I mean, I could have put a lot more verses here of just names, right? These are the names that go up on the wall of donors when you build a new building. This is what's being shown is who participated. And then notice we have the Tekoites made repairs, but their nobles would not put their shoulders to the work of the Lord. So here's a case, right? And the people are helping, but the elites are not. And Nehemiah seems attentive to the dynamics at play within his society. What's the relationship of the people and the elites? Who of the elites are on board with his populist project of rebuilding and who's not? And we see this in this detail about the Tekoites. This is not one of the chapters that I assigned for reading. It's got a lot of names in it, but sometimes buried within those names are important details like this one. And then we get some physical opposition. Sanballat and Tobiah are angry. They arm themselves. Nehemiah arms the people. Everybody working on the wall has a shovel in one hand and a weapon in the other. Half the people are guards, half the people are builders. And so in this way, the project is allowed to go forward. And in some ways, this is sort of replacing, the building project is replacing military service as the collective enterprise that the people get united around. In the days of David, the kings were always going out to war, raiding neighboring cities. Here, it's this building and construction project. And there's also economic opposition. So in order to fund this, right, some of the people had been essentially mortgaging their assets, their fields, and were in danger of losing them. And so we're not going to be able to work on the walls anymore because they were going to go into a kind of enslavement to their fellow Israelites. Nehemiah learns about this. He's furious. He says, don't oppress your own flesh and blood this way. And he rails against the elites on this and ends up suing them, right? Instead of going and fighting them, he sues them because this is, again, the context that we're in, a much larger sort of bureaucratic context. And so he rescues them from this and then eventually gets appointed himself as governor. And he refuses the food allowance from the Persian king. The governor was sort of entitled to take off some of the fat to feed himself. Nehemiah refuses this. He acquires no land as a result of this position of power. He gives a big feast for 150 people at a time out of his own pockets. And then he says to God, remember the good, O God, that I have done for my people. Right? There's not a lot of modesty in Nehemiah. And again, there's opposition from his opponents who try to lure him into the temple. Nehemiah refuses to go in. He's a eunuch. He's following the law. And so he's sort of portraying himself as sort of this hero here. Again, another list of donors, right, of the people who have funded and participated in this project. So that's the sort of rebuilding of the wall that's happening under Nehemiah and his role in this. And then the book returns. I'm gonna pause here. Are there questions about this? Because I'm about to return to Ezra. Yeah, I see Brent has a question.
Most of the prophets
Well, Rocky's coming in with a mic. Sorry, we just got to make sure you make it on the live stream.
Most of the prophets we've talked about so far have had a divine call. Mm-hmm. Is there any sense of a divine call, or Nehemiah and Ezra, are these historical figures who are advancing the narrative without a sense of a greater commission by God?
This is a good question. There's not the same kind of call story. I was sitting around minding my own business, and then the word of the Lord spoke to me. And there's often prayer that goes into this. Nehemiah is very scared to ask the king for permission to go back, right? He's this high official in the court. He's nervous so he prays for courage and prays for God to prosper their mission. Ezra does the same. This is a good question. I would need to look at the language and see how it talks about it, because it's certainly not divorced from a sense of having a divine a sense of a divine mission in this, but it's not the same sort of I was tapped on the shoulder out of nowhere to do this work. And the commission, there's a divine, there's a prayer, there's a divine commission, but there's also very much an imperial commission to this, and that's important too. But that's a great question. Yeah. Other thoughts now? Mark, yeah, go ahead. Okay.
This is both an observation and a question. Mm-hmm. Fascinating to me because many of the earlier stories we dealt with were actually not even sure that the characters existed. I mean, such as David, that's disputable.
Sure.
Here we're entering territory that's pretty well documented, mm-hmm. not just within the Bible itself, but throughout the region. And it seems to me one of the themes that we may be seeing is this tension, as you've already said, this tension between headquarters in Jerusalem, subject to the emperor, and folks out in rural areas who are doing things kind of their own way, in many different ways, and they get stigmatized all the way through the New Testament.
Yeah.
Is there any sense that this kind of centralization, as there only one way to do it, is even sort of a borrowing from the empire itself?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. How does the experience of empire, right? Because these are people who have lived several generations in an imperial context. A lot of this is shaped by the experience of the exiles. We don't have a lot of the writings of the people who remained in the land, right? And yeah, I think there is a way in which this does shape how these stories are understood and told. The importance of written edicts here, for example. And we're going to get to Ruth. I'm going to do some skipping in a little bit because we got to get to Ruth, because one thing I want us to take away is that this is not the only story of how this return happens and of what God is up to here. And one of the things that is, I think, a strength and even a saving grace of the Bible is its inclusion of multiple different narratives and accounts of things, and its refusal to look for a single story, because we're going to see this is a pretty biased story. I'll turn to that now. So Ezra comes and is teacher of the Torah. For some reason, there's a transposition of this. This is sort of belongs to the Ezra story, but it shows up in Nehemiah 9. Nehemiah as a character gets named in this part. There's been a little sort of cross-pollination between these two books, which are actually still one book in the Hebrew Bible, and in the Christian Bible, we're sort of considered one book up through the Middle Ages. So it's a little bit of an artificial distinction to separate them this way, but this is some material about Ezra that comes to us in the book of Nehemiah. He gathers all of the people into the square, the men and women and all who could hear with understanding, and then brings out the book of the law into the assembly and reads it before them. The ears of the people were attentive. There's this real vision here of this book as belonging to the community as a whole. This is one of the things I want to lift up about Ezra. It's one of my favorite moments in the book of Ezra, when it's important for all the people to gather and hear the book. And if we want to get a little bit meta now, I mean, part of what Matt and I were looking for in this moment of transition in our own context of Westminster, we were like, well, what do people do in times of transition? Well, they go back to their sources and they read them. And so we really wanted to engage together as a congregation in reading our own scriptures at this time. And we get this moment where Ezra kind of introduces this practice, and it's just beautiful. The people stand when the book is opened. Ezra blesses the Lord. This is a moment not just of teaching, but of worship. And so now worship is not just about sacrifices, it's also about teaching and study of the Torah. And then this whole group of named leaders helps the people understand. So it's important not just to hear it, but to understand it at all levels. God's relationship is not just with the king or leader, but with the entire group of people. And then the people respond. And we have, again, here, this two feelings at the same time, right? This mourning and this rejoicing. Now that they know, they've received the law again, they're like, oh gosh, there's a lot of ways in which we haven't held this up. And the rejoicing is Ezra and the leaders saying, no, this is a holy day. This is a celebration. We are at a new beginning. And so they rejoice and mourn at the same time. They commemorate the festival of Sukkot. I'm going to fly through this. The meaning is it's a harvest festival, but it also is the feast of booths. This is, you might see in your Jewish neighbors' lawns, like a fort shows up in the fall. That's a sukkah. That signifies dependence on God, the traveling through the wilderness. And then they have this communal prayer. It's attributed to Ezra, but likely it's on the lips of all the people. And it names, we're going to skip through this. Their communal prayer, they name God's creative acts and God's covenantal acts and God's saving acts, right? Delivering from Egypt, seeing the sea, giving manna and water, and then bringing the people into the land. There's a sense that this is a second Exodus. This is a second moment of lawgiving and return. Now I'm gonna fly through a list that's gonna have a lot of good lawyer words. But our ancestors rebelled, but you were forgiving, and you gave manna, nevertheless, they rebelled, right? You were patient, but they didn't listen, therefore, you gave them over to the people. We have this Deuteronomistic understanding of God punishing the people's disobedience to the covenant, and yet not forsaking them. And then in their communal prayer, then there's a now, therefore. They take on a responsibility for themselves. You have been just. And they do say here, we are slaves to this day. There's a real understanding we're not autonomous under Persia. We're still paying heavy taxes, so there's not a sense of everything is right and we're delivered. And they make a covenant together, all of the priests and officials, but all the people too. And they covenant to enter into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law. We might remember the blessings and curses at the end of Deuteronomy, right? This promise to take on this covenant. Here we're getting to a hard part. They say not to give our daughters in marriage to foreigners or take the daughters of the people of the land for our sons. So I told you we have this beautiful cultural moment of returning the law and the teaching to the people. we also see this other side where Ezra presents a very restrictive interpretation of the law that says no intermarriages are okay. We've come back, we have this moment of collective cultural identity, and part of the way that we protect this identity is by emphasizing marriage only within the group. And this is so painful to hear. I mean, if we think about our present context, where we've had restrictions on who can marry whom in terms of race and gender, and the pain that that causes in the individual lives of people, here we're seeing this doubling down at Ezra's encouragement against intermarriage. Watch the video with Chris Hayes. He becomes even more restrictive than was in the original Torah. The original Torah discouraged intermarriage to certain groups of people who had not helped the Israelites in returning to Egypt. There were traditions around that of not marrying Ammonites or Moabites. There were marriage with Egyptians was forbidden, but just until the third generation. Marriage to the Canaanites, because the Canaanites would distract you from worship of God by introducing idolatry, right? So there's reasons given against intermarriage in those contexts that have to do with people's ability to worship God. Ezra introduces this whole new concept about the holy seed, right? There's an idea of a kind of genetic continuity that Ezra is seeking to preserve here that's not part of the law that is being read, but that's this innovation in this way. And so this is where the books get really hard for me. There are parts of Ezra and Nehemiah that I love, and then there are parts that are this real doubling down against inclusivity. And the costs of that are high. I mean, the covenant, the practices include this expelling of people. And that's in the ancient world. You leave the community, and you're on your own. That's pretty close to a death sentence because of no longer having the protection of the husband of the community. So these are hard things to encounter at the same time. Here is Ezra weeping because he's realized how many intermarriages have taken place. That's the other thing to realize. The reason this prohibition is so strong is because everybody's doing it, right? There's a lot of intermarriages that have happened in this time. And so that's part of what makes this so hard for the people to observe. And we see here he's talking about the holy seed mixing itself with the peoples of the lands. And so the people, they gather, they weep, they decide that they're going to expel foreign wives and children. They set up judges to administer this. They name people who have married foreigners. And then at the last line, in the Greek version, all those that had married foreign women and children, and they sent them away. Hebrew version, different story. Some had wives with whom some had wives with whom they had sons. So one version of this makes it seem as though this was carried out. Another version just said, no, some of them had wives with whom they had sons, right? So there's ambiguity about what actually happened here, and there's ambiguity about what should have happened. And we're going to see this even stronger when we get to the book of Ruth. So we've already talked some about the context in which Ezra and Nehemiah are operating, and some of the reasons for this, that this moment of communal identity happens, and it's a moment that's included a lot of pain of the experience of exile, and it includes this practice of exclusion of foreigners from the community that maybe seems like a doubling down on some elements that are present in Torah, but this sort of radical interpretation of them. And so when we read these, it's important to understand the sort of context of where things are. It's also helpful to think that some of these intermarriages were among the elites who were sort of looking out for themselves by making strategic alliances with other families rather than looking out for the people, right? This is a big critique of Nehemiah's, is that the elites are ignoring the people. So there's not just one side to this story. But there is also this alternative vision that we get, which is the story of Ruth the Moabite. And I'm wondering, can anybody tell us the story of Ruth? Does anybody know the story of Ruth well enough to tell it, or want to at least tell part of it, want to begin the story of Ruth for us? Yes, Bill. Can we get Bill the mic?
Okay, I'm a little vague on this, but if I recall correctly, Ruth marries the son of Naomi, and he dies. Mm-hmm. So she was, and then Naomi says, "Well, go back to go back to your family.
Right.
And she says, no, I want to go with you, and your God will be my God, and your people will be my people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well done. Thank you for starting us out, Bill. Yeah, so Naomi marries a Moabite. She's an Israelite who's in Moab, and she has 2 sons. They marry Moabite women. No, Naomi and her husband go to Moab during a famine. Her sons marry Moabite women. They marry foreign women. Now, this happens, this is set long before the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. This is set before King David, early days. So this is imagining an earlier time. Moab doesn't even exist at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah in the same way. But Ruth marries an Israelite child marries a Moabite woman. He dies. And Ruth, the Moabite, says to Naomi, your people will be my people, your God will be my God, and goes back to the land of Israel with her mother-in-law, Naomi. So we have this foreigner, this Moabite, Ruth, who returns to the land with Naomi. Does anybody remember what happens next? Yes, Heather.
I hope I remember.
No, this is great. We're drawing the story out.
So Ruth then is single. Her husband dies, and she's single. And at that time, Ruth and Naomi are living alone, and they're poor. So Naomi encourages her to go to someone's land to harvest. So she becomes a harvester, but she's at the very end, gleaning the wheat. And then Ruth or Naomi says, go sleep next to the
Boaz.
Yes.
Thank you. Yep, absolutely.
Boaz falls in love with her. I think they get married. And she adopts the ways of the land.
Yes, yeah. She enters into the ways of the land. She marries a prominent citizen of the land, Boaz. And then Ruth has a child. And Ruth has a child who becomes part of the Davidic lineage. So Ruth is King David's, I don't know if she's grandma or great-grandma or something, but Ruth so enters the life of Israel, this foreigner entering the life of Israel, that David has a Moabite ancestor in spite of this prohibition. And sorry, go ahead, Heather. All the way to Jesus, right. Ruth shows up in the lineage of Jesus in the New Testament. So we have this incredible kind of counter-narrative that takes place. In our Christian Bibles, this gets placed, we sort of skipped it. It would happen after Judges, before 1 Samuel. In the Jewish Bible, it's included here closer to Ezra and Nehemiah. We don't know exactly when it was written, but a lot of scholars think it was sort of contemporaneous and offering a very different vision. One that doesn't say there's this prohibition that's inviolable, send the foreigner away. This is one where the foreigner enters the community and adds value to the community, right? Naomi, her name means weeping, and then by the end she says, I am blessed. There's this real arc of the story that happens out of Ruth's faithfulness. So and the other thing is that you guys could tell this story, right? If I'd said what happens in Ezra and Nehemiah, I think there would have been even more blank stares than what happens in the book of Ruth. But Ruth sticks with us. It's got 2 female protagonists. It's set in a time of famine that then becomes a time of plenty. There are no enemies in the book of Ruth. Think about how many enemies there were in Ezra and Nehemiah. Everybody's always arming themselves and fighting. And here, at every turn, there's misfortune, there's famine, but at every turn, she is welcomed. She's protected by Boaz even before they have their little barn scene. He's looking out for her while she's gleaning. And there is this ethos of sort of communal care of the people of the land. The word hesed shows up, which means loyalty and faithfulness. God's hesed is described, and so is Ruth's. And there aren't any divine appearances in Ruth. She doesn't get a call in the way of the prophets. But there's a lot of divine coincidences. It's one of those stories where things sort of work out and you see the hand of God in how things happen. And I think it's worth taking it a step out and looking at the role of story within the biblical context, especially what's the relationship between law and narrative. We had a lot of emphasis on law in Ezra and Nehemiah, although the people there were also able to recount the story, the history of the salvation of Israel. But here we have a short story, which is quite a remarkable thing to have in the Bible, to get a tightly plotted short story with unique characters who have identifiable traits who we care about. We want to follow them through. And I love this quote about story. This is from James Carse's Finite and Infinite Games. He says, "Explanations settle issues, showing that matters must end as they have. Narratives raise issues, showing that narratives do not end as they must, but as they do," right? Ruth doesn't contain a new law about who gets included. It contains a story of somebody in fact getting included, and in fact in a very major way. Explanation sets the need for further inquiry aside. Narrative invites us to rethink what we thought we knew. And so we have this narrative paired with this explanation that tamps things down. Ruth's story opens up. And Eugene Peterson has a line about the role of story here too. He's talking about here the role of story as opposed to history, right? There's this much larger history of the people, but in the context of this people who have learned to understand their lives historically as a connected, meaningful existence in which God's will mixed with their free will in ways that demonstrated purpose, this same people created this short story form. We don't have contemporaneous Persian short stories or Babylonian short stories. There's epics, there's other versions of narrative, but this is really a unique form. In order to show instances of this purposed, coherent history in local, daily situations among ordinary people, right? Ruth is the grandmother of someone royal, but she herself is not, and her story matters in the larger covenant story of God. So this is where I will end. Oh, except no, one more thing. So I already talked about where it is in the canon. Let's talk about where it is in the calendar. In the Jewish calendar, the book of Ruth is read at Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks. So if we have Passover, early spring, barley festival. Shavuot is right around like our kind of Pentecost time, Feast of Weeks, and that's the wheat festival. Sukkot, which we talked about before, fall, that's the fruit harvest. Shavuot is also associated with the commemoration of the giving of the law at Sinai, right? And this little short story is read at that same celebration of the giving of the law at Sinai. What's lifted up is not the doubling down, but the opening up. And that Ruth's participation in the covenant is considered a part of the covenant life of the people. And I just think there's something really beautiful about the way that these things exist in conversation and in dynamic tension together in the Bible, which is why we brought Ruth for you. Give it a read. It is a wonderful story. If you haven't had a chance to read it yet, do so and think about this story in particular in the context of questions about community and identity in a season of rebuilding. Any questions or comments? I've got about 3 minutes for them. I think we're off the live stream, but yeah, Heather, please.